Good morning, happy Earth Day, and welcome to the second session of the Global Energy Institute's EnergyInnovates program. Our series focuses on how technology innovation will play a critical enabling role to achieve significant and meaningful emission reductions. And I'm pleased to report that we have more than 750 registrants for today's event. The Energy Act of 2020 provides a roadmap, not just in how to pass important legislation with broad bipartisan support, but in authorizing research, development, and demonstration projects for the technologies that can provide affordable and achievable solutions. Now we must follow through and fund those important programs. Today, the President announced an ambitious target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, making our EnergyInnovates series even more timely. Our focus today is on carbon capture and carbon removal technologies, a widely acknowledged as critical factor in achieving national and global climate goals. In fact, the President specifically noted the importance of these technologies in his remarks this morning. Many corporations with global footprints are seeking carbon neutrality, and others are announcing major projects to vastly increase the scale of deployment of carbon capture, utilization, storage, and removal. As examples, just this week, ExxonMobil proposed a concept for developing a multi-user CCS hub to capture and store industrial emissions in the Houston area. And last week, Net Power announced plans to build 2 new natural gas plants where 100% of non-recycled emissions will be captured and stored. Today, we will hear from lawmakers and experts on what the future holds for CCUS and carbon removal in light of recent legislative developments, as well as the next set of policies necessary to accelerate the scaling and adoption of these technologies. But first, I'd like to welcome Senator John Barrasso from Wyoming. Senator Barrasso, ranking member on the Senate Energy Committee, has long been an advocate for CCUS and has worked across the aisle to advance the use of this important technology. We're thrilled to have him join us today. Senator?
Hi, I'm Senator John Barrasso from Wyoming. I serve as the ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Thanks so much for inviting me to address the Global Energy Institute's forum on the importance of carbon capture technologies and policies that support the development. I want to thank the Global Energy Institute's president, Marty Durbin, for the invitation. This is a fitting conversation for us to be having on Earth Day because traditional fossil fuels like oil and natural gas and coal are a critical part of America's energy future. We're going to continue to rely on these fuels for decades to come. Thanks to the development of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, these traditional fuels can also be part of America's clean energy future. Carbon capture is necessary to reduce emissions, while we're also delivering abundant and affordable energy to the nation. You don't have to take my word for it. The International Energy Agency calls carbon capture a key pillar in efforts to reduce emissions. It's really impossible to imagine significant global emission cuts occurring without carbon capture technologies. State governments, industry stakeholders, labor organizations like the Utility Workers Union of America, and environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy all recognize the importance of carbon capture. Carbon capture is a critically important technology for the simple reason that countries will continue to use fossil fuels well into the future. The best way to combat climate change is through innovation, not government taxation or regulation. Carbon capture technologies are a fantastic example of that innovation, and they have broad bipartisan support. Over the last few Congresses, I've worked closely with Democrat Senators Sheldon Whitehouse and Tom Carper, as well as Republicans Shelley Moore Capito and Kevin Cramer, and we worked together to pass laws to support carbon capture. 3 years ago, President Trump signed our bipartisan legislation to extend and expand the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture facilities. Now we must make sure that the credit can be deployed and used to build new carbon capture projects. Last year, we worked together again to pass historic legislation called the Use It Act. That stands for Utilizing Significant Emissions with Innovative Technologies Act, Use It Act. It supports the use of carbon capture technology, including direct air capture. The Use It Act helps researchers find commercial uses for captured carbon dioxide emissions. Captured carbon can be transformed into building materials, into clothing, and even hand sanitizer. It can also be used to extract more American energy. A process known as enhanced oil recovery is already used in my home state of Wyoming. Now, this is where carbon dioxide is injected into the ground to produce oil under older, more mature fields. Once the process is complete, the carbon dioxide is permanently stored underground. The Use It Act also directs the federal government to work with developers to expedite, not block, permitting. We know too well that delayed permitting can kill projects. The law will expedite the permitting of important carbon capture infrastructure like carbon pipelines and research facilities. Finally, the Use It Act also funds carbon capture research. This type of research is already occurring in Gillette, Wyoming at the Integrated Test Center. Located next to the Basin Electric's Dry Fork Power Station, the Integrated Test Center hosts research that will create new markets and new jobs in Wyoming. The senator will research how to transform coal power plant emissions into building materials like cement, as well as alternative fuels. Through a relationship with the X Prize, the center will welcome teams of researchers from around the world. Last year, as chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, I held a field hearing at the Integrated Test Center. We heard incredible testimony about the groundbreaking work happening at the facility and the untapped potential for carbon capture. We received updates on the Carbon Safe program located near the Integrated Test Center. The program is a remarkable partnership between the University of Wyoming and the Department of Energy to study the permanent storage of carbon dioxide in Wyoming's geologic formations. One of the experts who testified at the hearing, Dr. Holly Krutka, serves as executive director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming, and she's also participating in today's forum. She's a great example of how Wyoming is leading the way on carbon capture development. Not surprising to me that Wyoming can attract such top talent. In Wyoming, we're blessed with tremendous fuel resources, including coal, natural gas, and oil. Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon, and before him, Governor Matt Mead, have supported carbon capture development and have been instrumental in placing Wyoming at the center of it. Recently, the Bureau of Land Management completed its final environmental review and record of decision for the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative. This is our plan to build a carbon dioxide pipeline network all across the state. It's an important step toward building more carbon capture facilities in Wyoming. This pipeline infrastructure is going to create good-paying jobs and help make our energy development more sustainable. Looking forward, it's critical that the Department of Energy support carbon capture development. Last year, Congress passed the Energy Act that included several provisions to help with carbon capture. It's essential that these programs be established quickly and appropriately funded for them to be effective. If we're serious about reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, it's time we get serious about carbon capture. These technologies hold the key to significant carbon dioxide emission reductions while helping keep America both energy independent and energy dominant. Thank you for this important forum, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, welcome everybody to the panel discussion, and thank you, Senator Barrasso and Marty, for those opening remarks. The Energy Act was a pretty important accomplishment in the last Congress. It was bipartisan in its support, and it was pretty broad in its scope. It looked at a lot of different technologies and what we need to do to start stimulating and advancing them. Everything from renewable energy to advanced nuclear, electrification, and as well as carbon removal and carbon capture, the subject for our discussion today. We know, and we'll be hearing from Senator Whitehouse later, that there are bipartisan supporting members for all of these different technologies. Marty mentioned the president included carbon capture in his opening comments this morning on the Global Summit, Leadership Summit on Climate Change. But I also had a chance earlier today to look at the actual formal submittal that the United States made to the United Nations on its nationally determined contribution of a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. And it also included carbon capture, both in the power sector and in the industrial sector. So this is a technology that has high importance in the overall planning for carbon removal and greenhouse gases and climate change. So I want to get to some discussion with the panelists here. So I'm going to start, Gianna, with you. And thank you guys for joining. Could you, Gianna, as you can see on the screen, is from Carbon 180. Can you say a little bit about what are these various types of technologies and how you see their role playing in a carbon removal and a carbon reduce the economy in the future? Why don't you give us that kind of overview to start us? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Carbon 180 is a climate nonprofit that was really founded on the climate math. So in order to meet our climate goals, whether that's limiting warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, as outlined in the Paris Agreement, climate models really show that we need to be removing carbon on the scale of 10 gigatons by 2050. And that's a really large amount compared to where we are now. And there's sort of a portfolio of solutions that can remove carbon at this scale, ranging from land sector solutions like forestry and agriculture to tech-based solutions like direct air capture, which are basically large fans that use chemical reactions to separate CO2 from the air, as well as what we call carbon tech or carbon utilization, technologies that use carbon from either direct air capture or from traditional CCS plants, and turn that into valuable products like building materials, fuels, plastics, and chemicals. And then finally, technologies like bioenergy with CCS. And all of these technologies together not just reduce emissions, but actually can create net negative emissions. And that's really critical to meeting our climate goals. It can help clean up historic emissions and also account for some really difficult to decarbonize sectors. And we've seen a ton of interest from the public and private sector over the last 5 years in really scaling up these critical climate technologies.
Great. Thanks for that overview. Carbon 180 also has been thinking about policies that might be helpful to stimulate and accelerate the kind of work we need here to enhance the ambition of our climate goals. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the policies that you all have been looking at?
Yeah, and like I mentioned, I think we've seen such an increase in interest from policymakers in developing and deploying these solutions. And I think we have a really great playbook from other climate technologies like solar and wind, thinking about how do we bring these solutions from, for example, with solar, very high cost, very low deployment rates in the early 70s to now being at cost parity with other energy technologies, and also deployed at larger scale. So I think we have a little bit of a playbook that we can apply to carbon removal technologies. So I think a couple priorities that are really key, increasing RD&D funding, and like Marty mentioned at the beginning, really appropriating funding for newly authorized programs that were passed in the Energy Act of 2020, an increased focus on not just research and development, but also demonstration. This is a really key piece that's necessary to drive down technology costs, which is actually one of the core barriers to carbon removal technologies. Right now, we're seeing direct air capture plants really range in terms of capture cost from around $200 to $600 per ton of CO2. And we really need to see that number down to the $50 to $100 per ton of CO2. And in order to do that, we need to really drastically ramp up research development and demonstration. In addition to that, early markets are really important for these technologies in order to reach economies of scale and to really test out these technologies in the real world. And there are a number of tools that the federal government can use, things like production and investment tax credits, bolstering the existing 45Q tax credit, as well as using potential procurement mechanisms to really create first markets for these solutions. And then I think finally, there's sort of an increased need for regulatory structures around these solutions, and particularly increasing the capacity for permitting under the Class 6 well program, which is a program that supports the storage of permanent carbon dioxide in geologic reservoirs. And in the past, we've seen some of these regulations be a barrier to project developers really getting projects in the ground just because of limited capacity at EPA. So I think those are sort of our priorities for the next year. And if we sort of deploy all those tools in our toolkit, we can really bring down the cost of these solutions and bring them to scale.
Great. Yeah, Class 6 wells, that's to protect the groundwater. So you need to have the capacity at EPA to be able to move that forward. And I think we see some of that starting to happen in the budget proposals that are out there. Well, Michelle, let me turn to you next. Gianna mentioned solar and wind, and of course, many people recognize how much work has gone on in the technology sector on building renewable energy as part of the portfolio that they have to power their systems. But Microsoft is getting more aggressive about the future here and is also looking at carbon reduction strategies. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the work you guys are doing and how it fits into your plans?
Thank you, Bob. So I'm Michelle Pater. I'm Senior Director for Sustainability Policy at Microsoft, and I'm in charge of leading our energy and sustainability policy work. And just really excited to be here today to talk about the critical role of carbon removal and really what are our shared priorities on this issue. And so many of you might be saying, why does Microsoft on a panel related to carbon removal? A year ago, we made a really ambitious commitment to be carbon negative by 2030. And what that means is we are going to reduce our carbon footprint as much as we can, including being 100% renewable energy for our facilities and our data centers. And we're going to keep going, but we also know that we need to do removal, and we'll remove the rest. And then we'll continue going, removing our historic footprint that we put into the atmosphere since 1973, and we'll look to achieve that by 2050. And so to us, carbon removal is essential to hitting 1.5 degrees as a company, as a country, and as a world. As Gianni mentioned, there are two types of carbon solutions. There are nature-based solutions like farms and forests and ecosystems that tend to be short-term, think decades. And then there are these longer duration storage, which can take carbon and put it away for thousands of years. And these are these engineered solutions, and they're both going to be critical. So we made this announcement, we made this commitment, and then we had to go execute. So since there's no structured voluntary carbon removal market, we had to start from scratch. And last July, Microsoft put out an RFP, a request for proposals to remove 1 million metric tons for this coming year. And we were blown away by the response. We received about 200 bids from groups around the country and around the world. We hired 2 outside scientific experts to help us do our analysis so we can look at additionality, how our investment would really move the needle on carbon, actual net negative carbon removal, durability, how long would they stay stored, and clear scientific accounting to make sure that the removal was happening. Of the 55 million metric tons of proposals that we received, about 5% met this criteria. So we selected 26 projects to purchase and fund 1.3 million tons of removal this coming year. To be frank, the majority of those were nature-based solutions. Almost 99% of those were nature-based solutions. Only 1% were engineered solutions, and they include biochar projects in Europe and Australia, bioenergy carbon capture project in Oklahoma, and a direct air capture project in Iceland. And I think this really goes to the biggest challenge that engineered solutions face, is that we need to scale the supply and we need to bring down the costs, exactly what Gianna was saying. Since we were probably, we know we were one of the first, if not the first corporate buyers to do this, we wanted to do our homework. We wanted to be thorough and transparent. So all the information that I've shared with you is available on the Microsoft Carbon Removal website. We also did a white paper to really just to demonstrate the bids and to talk about our learnings. We see a huge opportunity here to build out this market and to deal with those twin challenges of scaling supply and bringing down cost. And the areas are research and development, and to really get to that first mover deployment. A lot of the programs that were authorized in the Use It Act and the Energy Act that Bob, Gianna, Marty, and Senator Barrasso talked to, getting that to the next stage. Another key area is infrastructure, including responsible storage and ongoing monitoring of that storage. And the last piece is financing. And there's a lot of different levers to think creatively about financing here. And the challenge when it comes to carbon removal is that it's not a substitute. It's not like renewable energy where it's a different type of electricity, or electric vehicles where it's a different type of transportation. Removing carbon from the air is really a public good. And so we need to think creatively about how do we really scale demand. Obviously, the 45Q tax credit has begun to do this, and there are proposals that are out there to provide a greater value for carbon removal. There is public procurement opportunities that can scale this, as well as a private procurement, and even thinking about the compliance lever, because the California Low Carbon Fuel Standards includes direct air capture as a compliance lever. There are some congressional proposals that have compliance lever as well. And so thinking creatively about how do we bring more financing to this area. I think in a bit of a politically charged environment, we are so encouraged that we see both parties coming forward with ideas on how to advance and scale carbon removal. So we're pretty optimistic, and we're excited about the opportunity for stakeholders like the ones that are on this panel today to work with policymakers to really develop the solutions to unlock the carbon and economic opportunities here.
Wow, great, Michelle. I'm going to turn to Holly in just a minute, because research and development has come up several times here, and I think it's really important. But I'm going to ask if Michelle, if you could just say very quickly, how did you guys, in the simplest way you can, deal with the concept of additionality? The fact that whatever you're removing is not something that would have been removed anyway. I mean, it's a pretty complicated subject, and you could go on for a while, but give me a quick one on this, because obviously you guys are doing it.
I think we're trying to show our work. This is a learning process. So, I think we go through all of this in the white paper of really trying to do that scientific accounting of what are the baselines, what is the investment enable. But it's an area that needs groups to come together to really agree on how do we understand it, how do we assess additionality.
All right. Well, that's a good thing. So, Holly, at the University of Wyoming, you got a shout out from Senator Barrasso and the work that you guys are doing. I'm generally familiar with it from my work with the Carbon Capture Coalition and others. But why don't you fill us in on sort of what's going on at the university now on this subject?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. And I'll try to live up to that very kind introduction from our senior senator. And I just want to thank the organizers. A great panel to be on. So let me talk a little bit first more broadly about the state of Wyoming and what we're doing, and then I'll talk about our unit here at the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. So last July, the Wyoming Energy Authority was stood up and tasked with developing an energy strategy for the state. And I can tell you today that energy strategy does include an economy-wide net zero target. And we cannot achieve that without CCUS. Wyoming's ambitions on CCUS are broader than our state borders, though. The state of Wyoming wants to be a leader. We are open for business, for project developers, and we want to see the technology get deployed and demonstrated here. But 90% of the energy produced in Wyoming leaves our borders. So we are a huge exporter. We're a small population, huge exports. And we want to do the same thing with the technology. Just as Michelle and Gianna have already mentioned, the first 1, 2, 3 plants that you build are going to be expensive because they're first of a kind. You're still learning. But time and time again, with energy and other technologies, we know that these technology costs decrease with deployment. So we want to help bring the cost down here in Wyoming. So there's a lot of attributes here in the state too that are going to help us do that. For example, we have the right geology to do the CO2 storage. The Rock Springs uplift, just one formation, is estimated to be able to hold 26 billion tons of CO2. That's between 400 and 500 years of all the emissions from the state. But we are every day, the School of Energy Resources, we're investigating new geologic formations that can hold CO2 for geological timescales. Our state is very CCUS policy friendly, and the state legislature is investing in this space. We are also one of 2 states that has Class 6 primacy. So the Wyoming DEQ can provide Class 6 permits for underground CO2 storage. And the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, we believe we are going to be the first entity awarded a Class 6 permit, and that's under our Carbon Safe project I'll talk about in just a minute. And I'd also like to point out that don't forget that we need to look at the whole life cycle of emissions. And Wyoming is one of the states with a great deal of energy production on federal lands. And we do have some very responsible energy producers. So one of our research projects actually has to do with upstream emissions. And we have a Center for Air Quality Research, and they focus on measuring and detecting upstream methane emissions from energy production. And focusing just on natural gas, we have a producer in the state who produces 90% of Wyoming natural gas is produced on federal lands. And so they largely produce on federal lands. And they have voluntarily reduced their upstream methane emissions and had third-party verification of that. So they are a leader, and they're working with our research unit to make sure we can measure all those methane emissions, and they know exactly how much is being emitted and how to stop it from being emitted. And so then when you couple that with CCUS on the back end, you can get a very, very low carbon life cycle product from Wyoming and other fossil fuels. And that's why we think it's really important not to ban energy production on federal lands, because we can do it responsibly here. And our studies have shown that potentially emissions could even rise, especially from oil production in other places compared to production on federal lands. So we want to be part of the solution. So let me just talk a little bit about what the School of Energy Resources is doing specifically. Our largest flagship project is the Carbon Safe project. That's a $20 million project looking at a commercial scale CO2 storage site. So it's research, but it's commercial scale. So we're looking at a storage site adjacent to Basin Electric's state-of-the-art Dry Fork power plant, and that site has to be able to accept at least 2 million tons of CO2 per year and at least 50 million tons of CO2 total over the life of a potential project. So we are working at scale. We also look at the impacts of different technology. And the other thing that we're looking at that's been touched on a little bit is all the different areas that CCUS can be an enabler for. So for example, hydrogen from fossil fuels, CCUS can help reduce emissions from that. And by the way, we're all of the above research. We look at wind, solar, rare earth elements needed to drive those technologies, and hydrogen from green and blue and almost any other color as long as it's clean. And the other area we're interested in is carbon removal. Wyoming's a big state with lots of land and great CO2 storage potential. So we want folks to come here and develop carbon removal projects. So we're all of the above. We're focused at commercial scale. And I'll tell you, one of the most exciting things happening now is that we are starting to see developers come to the state. So those of us that worked on the research side for years, we are seeing commercial developers start to develop projects. And a lot of these aren't public. I know that there was the graphic with those that have been announced as a result of 45Q, but what I'll say is policy works. Investing in R&D works. We're ready to deploy, demonstrate and deploy this technology. And the more policy help we get, I think the broader the deployment will be. So that's it. Thanks, Bob.
All right, that was good. You know, I think I'm going to drift into some of the audience questions. They're starting to filter in here, and they relate to some of the things you've been talking about and some of the additional questions I would ask. So I think we can merge some of this in here. And a number of you have already brought up the issue of Class 6 wells and Wyoming having primacy. Just so the audience knows, under the Safe Drinking Water Act, EPA can grant a state the primacy to implement that program. But what lacks from many of the looks that I've done, and I'm going to ask each one of you maybe for a comment on this, although Michelle, I don't know if you guys are looking at this particular issue, but the lack of federal grants to states to run the programs, the lack of capacity at EPA and their regional offices. For you, it would be in Denver, Holly, and to be able to analyze the work, and the fact that so few Class 6 wells have been permitted, the experience and the practice is still very immature. So why don't there's a general question about barriers, but this one is a specific one that has come up in terms of speed. So I'll start, Gianna, with you, and then Holly, and Michelle, you can add if you would like. Gianna?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start off by saying the Class 6 well program is critical to ensure that we have safe and permanent geologic storage, and that we are keeping the health and well-being of the communities in which these projects are implemented at the very front of our decarbonization efforts. That being said, I totally agree. I think we need to increase the capacity of EPA to both review Class 6 well permits, but also to support states in accessing primacy. This is one of the things that we actually saw included in the Clean Future Act, which is a piece of legislation that's currently introduced in the House, where there's actually block grants to states that would help them both apply for primacy, but then also give them some technical assistance and grants to actually run these programs over the long term. In addition, I'll also flag one of the things that we've also been thinking about at Carbon 180 is how potentially Department of Interior or other federal agencies could think about pre-permitting geologic storage sites or direct air capture projects on federal lands across the United States as a way to continue to expedite these projects in a way that matches the urgency of the climate crisis, but also, again, keeps these frontline and vulnerable communities top of mind and make sure that we are deploying these projects in a really safe and responsible way.
All right. Well, obviously, getting some federal resources and focus on this is one of the answers. Do you, Holly, do you have any additional points to make on that, since what you're actually in the middle of doing it, I think?
Yeah. So Gianna really hit the nail on the head. The only thing I would add, I mean, I think Class 6 primacy for states is going to be really helpful because we, for example, in Wyoming, our Wyoming DEQ is going to understand our subsurface better and be able to act more swiftly than the federal EPA. And so that's what we're hoping, that we can expedite projects. But having said that, here at the School of Energy Resources, we're looking to get the first, we believe will be the first Class 6 permit in the state. And you have to get a lot of subsurface information before you can really apply. So the approach we're taking now is we're going after a Class 1 permit, and then we'll have to convert it. So we're still ironing out some wrinkles and trying to figure out exactly what the best process is. But there's no question, more resources, and also just like the technology, as soon as we start getting through having awarded some of these permits, I think hopefully the process will become smoother and smoother. But yeah, I totally agree that there needs to be resources put towards this. And I would also say, I would add one thing is, states like Wyoming often have a checkerboard of state, private, federal land. And we definitely agree that there could be some pre-permitting work done. And we've been looking into how we could help with that here in our state. And I think that would be applicable elsewhere. But we also need to figure out how does the policy work if the land in the pore space is all divided up, because while CO2 can be safely stored underground in geologic formations, it doesn't know where it is, right? It could easily go from a state checkerboard piece to federal and back to state. So something else to think about.
Yeah. Well, there's a number of questions that continue to come in on Class 6, and I'll say another word or two about it. But Michelle, I don't want to leave you out if you have anything you want to say about this.
On Class 6, but I just want to up level for a second. I just think that there is this urgency to have such tighter both collaboration and planning done between states, private, local, and federal, and really just kind of the strategic partnership. I mean, we're seeing outside the U.S. strategic hubs of storage developing and kind of ecosystems for carbon removal, if it's in Norway and the UK, really just making leaps and bounds. And it's that really close collaboration that's enabling it.
Yeah, yes. I mean, and going back to Holly's points and some of the questions, and I'll just say, there's been questions about whether the legislation should be fixed in the Safe Drinking Water Act or the regulation should be fixed. And I think, Holly, the work you guys are doing and others are doing to actually get through the process and figure out what the parameters are that have to be built into the permitting and how much monitoring is needed or and for how long, and all of these issues that come up, I think will help move the program forward. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I think EPA can modify the regulations if they have more data and more information from people who are working on it, like research institutions like the University of Wyoming. You know, another general question that's come up is, you know, what are some of the other barriers? You know, price, I think, has been mentioned. Obviously, some of the regulatory environment. You guys have thoughts on other barriers that should be looked at as we go forward in legislation or in regulation even? I'll start with Gianna.
Yeah, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I think having a strong market and customer is an additional barrier that is, of course, connected to price. But I think, you know, we touched upon this a little bit earlier in the panel, as compared to things like renewable energy, there isn't already a robust market in which these technologies can enter. Carbon removal is really, at the moment, about, you know, removing tons and fighting climate change, and the extent to which we can use carbon utilization, direct procurement of carbon removal solutions, or other market mechanisms to help drive the deployment of these solutions and be first customers for a lot of these technology developers is extremely critical, just because there aren't mature markets that they can enter today in which they actually get, you know, an economic benefit from selling their product. And I think that is really tough for them in order to not just prove out their technologies and deploy it, but also getting the finance and investment they need to launch projects.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, you're involved with trying to create a market here. So, and I was surprised at the enthusiasm, not surprised, but I think I was informed by the robust response you had to your RFP. Do you think other companies should be doing this? Do you know, are you guys going to do more to help maybe stimulate this?
You know, that's our goal, right? If we look back and in 5 years or 10 years, it's only Microsoft that is doing this, then we failed, right? This is about, you know, talking about radical collaboration, but really scaling all of these technologies. And what, you know, Gianna just said is that's key. It's like we need to get supply, and in order to get to supply, we have to create long-term demand. And that's where this comes from. We have to create demand through procurement. We have to create demand through compliance mechanisms, lots of different ways. I mean, it's been so great to see what Wyoming is doing in this space. You know, Microsoft has a really significant presence in Wyoming. And when we made our carbon removal announcement, you know, it should be no shock that the Wyoming delegation and the governor are just so excited to learn more and to figure out ways to work together. So I think that we just need to really scale up supply and create that demand.
And Holly, do you have any? I'm going to have one lightning round here after this, after you chime in a little bit on this particular issue.
Yeah, no, I'll just add a little bit, maybe just a little specific on what might help on the policy side. And of course, you've got some great experts here. And I don't want to get over my skis, but I would say, you know, we work with a lot of entities that are nonprofits and looking into the tax equity market to monetize 45Q tax credits. It's a bit saturated, and refundability could make a big difference in getting some of these project developers that are in Wyoming and other states, just get them over the fence and try to get these projects announced and get them deployed and start bringing down those costs.
Yeah, I think all of us who worked on getting 45Q enacted and then time extension and then bugged the Treasury Department to get the regulations done, all of these things really are hoping that in the next year to 24 months, that's really that financial incentive is really going to start to pay off. All right, so here's the lightning round because we only have a couple of minutes. For each one of you, Michelle, I'm going to start with you on this. If there was one thing that could be in an infrastructure bill that Congress was fooling around with, and forget the who's got how many different parts of the instruction, but assume there will be one, what is the one thing that you think could be in the infrastructure bill that would really help us go further than even we did with the Energy Act and 45Q? And Michelle, let's start with you.
I think it's infrastructure. I mean, I think it's everything. There's not, it's just great that we're having the conversations because, the country needs it.
Yeah. All right, Jana.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think for me, and I've touched upon this a little bit, I think procurement is a really powerful market mechanism. Carbon 180 put out a report about low embodied carbon cement and concrete and using carbon removal technologies to help decarbonize buildings. And I think that could be a really critical piece of infrastructure that could have a huge climate impact and also help create early markets for these solutions.
Okay. And Holly?
My answer is money for demonstrations. Let's prove that it works, go big, and I think that we'll be on the downhill slope for getting this deployed from there.
Yeah, all of these things are important, and I think we do have an opportunity, particularly on the bipartisan coming together on infrastructure here, which everyone wants to do some, so I'm hoping they'll be able to do it. But I'm going to have to turn this back over to, I think, Marty. To take us on. I want to thank you guys. I think you covered the landscape pretty well on what's going on here. I think we've seen from what's going on at the summit this week and in other forums how important this technology is to the broader decarbonization net zero goals that the world needs to have by the middle of the century. So thank you all for the work each one of you is doing on this, and I appreciate having the time to talk with you. Back to you guys.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Senator, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Marty.
Senator, the Chamber's been highlighting the enormous achievement of the previous Congress in passing the Energy Act, the HFC phase down, the Use It Act, and many other important climate-related provisions, and the fact that they were enacted with broad bipartisan support. So first, I want to thank you for the role you played in that effort. Our EnergyInnovates series, for which you're kind enough to join us today, is focusing on leveraging that bipartisan success by securing funding for the research, development, and demonstration projects authorized in that package, from battery storage, advanced nuclear, and grid modernization, to renewables and carbon capture. You've been an outspoken leader of carbon capture and removal technologies, including the 45Q tax credit, the Use It Act, and the Clean Industrial Technology Act. And you were effective in reaching across the aisle to advance these proposals, in addition to other priorities you fought for in that package. So given that today's event is focused on carbon capture and removal, I want to invite you to share with us why you've been a leader in promoting the necessity of these technologies.
Well, I suppose at the macro level, it's because I don't want my grandchildren to despise me. I feel we've really gone past the rumble strip and off into off the highway of safety in climate. And while we work to be in a place to pass a really significant piece of climate legislation. I think we need to do everything that we possibly can in the meantime. And I think that these programs also stand the chance of being able to dramatically grow as technologies develop and as incentives develop. So an early start can make a big difference.
Great. Well, not everyone, as you know, shares your and our enthusiasm for these technologies. You have a well-deserved reputation as both a fierce advocate for progressive values and as a thoughtful leader who reaches across the aisle. So help us understand how you respond to those who raise concerns about carbon capture technologies.
Well, first of all, I think we have to, at some point, open up the prospect of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I don't think reducing emissions at this point is going to be enough. It is certainly a tool that we want to have available to us as the climate crisis grows. So I think it's really important that we not get too fussy about which different mechanism we use to try to get our arms around the climate emergency. I think it's really important that we try throwing everything we can at the problem until we feel that we're on a really safe path. And at the moment, we're not there. So I want to do everything possible. And certainly carbon capture and carbon removal is an important part of that portfolio.
Great. We saw just last week that Net Power intends to build 2 new natural gas power plants in the U.S. that will have all its emissions captured and buried deep underground. While I'm not plugging one company or one technology, this is a potential example of how technologies that either don't yet exist or are not yet commercial can help us achieve our emission reduction goals. Can you share your views on how best to foster the kinds of innovation that we're going to need to address the global climate challenge?
Well, the thing that I care the most about and that I think will be most effective is to put a proper price on carbon emissions, generally on greenhouse gas emissions. You mentioned a natural gas plant. There's an awful lot of methane leakage out there. That methane leakage might even offset the savings at the burner tip of natural gas versus coal and oil. So it's really important that we get our arms around the whole problem. And I think a significant price on carbon emissions sends a very important market signal, encourages needed innovation, and helps offset what the International Monetary Fund now calculates as a 600 billion, that's billion with a B, dollar subsidy for fossil fuels just in the United States of America every single year.
Great. Well, to one of the points you made, you were also a leader in the Clean Industrial Technology Act, which promotes innovation to decarbonize the hard to reduce industrial sources, so steel, cement, chemicals, et cetera. So can you share with our audience the importance of this piece of the equation and the role carbon capture will likely play in that?
I think the importance of this is that as you look at the economy and divide it into sectors, the utility sector is actually performing pretty well. It's the best performing sector in terms of emissions reductions. And that's because there's fairly common setup for electric utilities. I think we have to look at this problem economic sector by economic sector because each is different. And this, I think, is a real opportunity to make some progress in the industrial sector.
Great. I think that's an important point. We certainly share your view on that. So full disclosure, I serve on the Bipartisan Policy Center's Direct Air Capture Advisory Council. So while that technology is not yet deployable at scale, it enjoys support from the likes of Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and in addition to many other major corporations. So how do you view the need for and the outlook for such negative emissions technologies?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I just don't think that it's at all clear that we're going to be able to get from where we are to having a safe climate and non-poisoned oceans. And by poison, I mean acidified by the carbon dioxide emissions. Just on emissions reduction, we may very well overshoot and then have to claw back. And to do that, we need to actually reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not just stop putting it in as rapidly. So I think it's a really vital tool. It could be, the real essential tool that we need. And the technology is not developed very well because there really isn't much of a market signal. There's not much of a financial reward for doing this. But one of the things that I hope about a really robust price on carbon is that whatever your cost per ton of avoided emissions is, that's a revenue for innovators who want to work in this direct air capture space. And I think at that point, the technology will develop very quickly.
Great. I think it's an excellent point. So kind of a final wrap-up question. I wanted to ask you, and please, this is your opening here. How can we best partner with you and your colleagues? I mean, you've shown that you not only reach across the aisle. We started this program today with comments from your colleague, Senator Barrasso. But so how can we work with you and your colleagues best to ensure that the important programs authorized in the year-end climate and energy package will receive the funding they need to be successful? And kind of the next step of private sector being able to, commercialize and deploy these important technologies.
Well, I think the chamber as a political force is a very, very powerful one. It may be the single most powerful political force in Washington. And so I think as you gear up towards actually supporting a specific carbon price, which I think is the ultimate goal that you and I are working towards, it's important along the way to encourage these intermediate steps. And I think we're in a pretty good place to do this. It would be great if the chamber could encourage Republicans to support some of this so we don't have to go through reconciliation to get it passed, because reconciliation limits what we can do. It lets us do some of the hard things, but some of the things that would moderate that rather harsh effect will end up on the cutting room floor at the parliamentarians' hands. So I think the key thing is to try to get some of these intermediate steps passed in a bipartisan fashion, and that means getting Republicans to support them and let us get it done.
Well, Senator, the chamber certainly shares your view about trying to avoid reconciliation, and I do think that the Energy Act that passed last year is a model for how Congress can work across the aisle and work through regular order to get really significant and important legislation done. So I look forward to working with you personally to continue to advance our goals here. And again, just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Marty. I look forward to working with you as well. And I'll just close by saying I think it's really important that we keep our eye on the real target here, which isn't bipartisanship or passing significant legislation. It's getting safely to less than 1.5 degrees global planetary warming.
Wonderful. Again, thank you, Senator. Talk to you and look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty and Senator Whitehouse, all of you for joining us. We're here in our Future Trend panel. It's a pleasure to be with you and with our distinguished panelists. Dan Lashoff is director of the World Resources Institute, US. He coordinates WRI's work in the United States across climate, energy, food, forest, water, and sustainable cities program. This includes overseeing the work in the US climate team, which aims to catalyze support of climate action by states, cities, and the business community. Dr. Jennifer Wilcox, the Acting Assistant Secretary in the Office of Fossil Energy at DOE, was Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering at Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. As a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, he led WRI's carbon removal program. Dan and Dan, we heard from more than one of our previous experts that to reach ambitious climate goals, we can't foreclose any possible option. All the tools need to be on the table, including CCUS and carbon removal. Our discussion is focused on future trends and next steps. What can we do in addition to funding for the RD&D programs and pilot programs at DOE that were authorized by the Energy Act. We have about 15 minutes of discussion and 10 minutes of audience Q&A. I encourage the audience to please put your questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. So let's get started. Welcome, Dan and Jen. Jen, based on Senator Whitehouse's comments on the importance of manufacturing applications for CCUS and in the industrial sector, what are your priorities for decarbonization and carbon removal?
Sure, thanks for having me. So first, I just want to say in the Department of Energy, there's been a lot of focus on decarbonization of the industrial sector previously. In this space, the low-hanging fruit associated with carbon capture are scenarios where you have higher concentrations of carbon dioxide. And these situations exist in the bioethanol production and also in hydrogen production. Globally, hydrogen is really produced from natural gas we're forming today. And so there are opportunities and technologies that exist that are commercial for capturing carbon dioxide from making hydrogen from natural gas. And so one of the projects that we funded in the early days back in 2013 is one that's located in Port Arthur, Texas. It has actually injected about 7 million tons of CO2 into the earth. And so that is a facility that we funded and started in terms of demonstration. And now, more recently, a lot of the work is not so much the low-hanging fruit of like bioethanol, for instance, and hydrogen production, but more in the area of cement and decarbonization of cement and also steel. And so more recently, we've invested in projects looking at carbon capture associated with the cement industry. One project in particular in Colorado and looking at decarbonization of that plant. And I also want to point out, oftentimes carbon capture gets coupled to just the fossil industry. And in the case of the industrial sector, it's more complicated than that. When we make cement, for instance, the feedstock of cement is limestone. That's calcium carbonate. And so in order to produce calcium oxide, which is essentially cement in the end, the glue that holds the rock together to make concrete, when you heat the limestone to a high temperature, it actually chemically produces carbon dioxide. So it's not necessarily when you're generating electricity using fossil fuels and doing carbon capture. In this case, the CO2 is actually more concentrated. And so it's cheaper to capture the CO2 in a sense, because the concentration of the CO2 in the exhaust stream is higher than it is from a power plant. And so this just hasn't gotten as much attention as the electricity sector in the past, but it's something that we're excited about and something that we're investing in. And we've also looked at, again, we have another project that's associated with carbon capture at a steel plant. And if we can kind of think about these opportunities to decarbonize these supply chains, we could also couple that to procurement opportunities associated with these low carbon supply chains. And so those are just some of the projects that we're excited about.
Well, could you talk a little bit more about the procurement opportunities? We heard a little bit from the previous panel on how Microsoft is using its procurement power. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I think it's not just, so Microsoft and a number of corporations have really made net zero pledges over the last year. We've seen a lot of excitement in that space. And it's finding or accessing supply chains, and some of these include the cement and steel industry that I've talked about, but also reducing the carbon intensity of fuels is another supply chain that's of interest. Reducing the carbon intensity of how plastics are made today, and nylon and polyester. These are all sectors that we have opportunities either with carbon capture or carbon utilization, using CO2 as a feedstock, to look at reducing the carbon intensities of these different supply chains. And so corporations are one example of where you see leaning in, willing to pay more, seeing the value in these purchases. But also I think that the federal government has an opportunity with all of the roads that we build, and the bridges and the dams, and even the fuel that we use, that there could also be an opportunity to tap in to that as well.
Thanks, Jen. So we'll turn to you, Dan. So why do you think carbon removal is a potentially cost-effective option for decarbonization going forward?
Well, if we look at a target like the one President Biden announced this morning, reducing U.S. emissions 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030, the vast majority of that will actually be achieved by building out more wind and solar, by retiring uncontrolled coal plants, by producing electric cars. But I think carbon capture will play a role, particularly in the industrial sector. As Jen mentioned, it's CO2 is a byproduct of making cement, and there's no other alternative right now, so we'll need some of that. But in the long run, to sustain the reductions beyond 2030 and get to the net zero target that the president has also committed to, we're going to need every tool, as you said, and carbon capture will play an increasing role, both to eliminate emissions from hard to abate point sources, but also increasingly over time to remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere through direct air capture and sequestration of that, which will be necessary to compensate for some of the emission sources that would just be impossible or too expensive to eliminate.
So do you see that any particular policies necessary to take something like direct air capture to scale? There was some mention of that, I think, by Gianna in the earlier panel. Want to talk a little bit more about those issues?
Yeah, a couple of things. In the short term, we need to invest in the infrastructure to allow CO2, once it's captured, to be transported and safely sequestered underground. So the Scale It Act, which the Chamber has supported, and we hope to get across the finish line this year with the Chamber's help, is one piece of that. President Biden has included that as part of the American Jobs Plan. The other piece would be enhancing the 45Q tax credit specifically for direct air capture, increasing the rate for direct air capture up to $120 a ton of CO2 removed from the atmosphere when the CO2 is being stored in saline aquifers and not used for enhanced oil recovery. In the case of enhanced oil recovery, you have a revenue source, and so you don't need as high a credit. But if you're just sequestering it without that revenue source, you need a higher level. So that legislation has been introduced to further enhance 45Q and to extend it for another 5 years to make sure that those projects have a chance to be designed and financed and built within that time frame. So those are two things. But then in the long run, as Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said, you absolutely have to have a market signal that values eliminating carbon emissions and capturing it. So whether that's through an overall cap on emissions, a cap on the power sector through a clean electricity standard, or a carbon tax, we are pretty ecumenical about the specifics of the mechanism. But again, as the senator said, the key here is to actually get to the net zero emissions through whatever mechanism the Congress ultimately decides to enact.
I think that's a really important point, and I think that gets to the kind of the U in CCUS, the utilization piece. I throw it out to both of you. You know, how do we build out the markets necessary to utilize the captured CO2, and what do you think the next steps might be, both on the investment side, and then Dan, maybe you can talk a little bit about policies in addition to this that might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I can comment a little bit. So in terms of the utilization, I mean, I think it is a little bit tricky. The question is, what products scale to the emissions today? And that's why we often will say, well, no, we need to couple it to dedicated storage, because we have enough pore space in the rocks that we've actually gotten the fossil fuels out of to begin with to put the CO2 back. But as Dan mentioned, you know, that the policy and the incentives aren't there to make that economically viable at the scale we need it to be today. So we turn to this concept of taking CO2 and making value out of a product. And one industry that does scale that I think is pretty interesting is concrete. And so CO2, if you react it with an alkaline feedstock like magnesium or calcium, which by the way is often a waste material associated with the mining industry and tailings, you can form a synthetic aggregate like a rock that can be used as a feedstock to making concrete and building materials. So that's one way that you can lock carbon away permanently. You can also, just thinking about the value, you can take CO2 as a feedstock and react it with clean hydrogen to make fuel or to make a feedstock to making a product that we would typically get from natural gas or crude oil today, like plastic or nylon or polyester. And so that's another pathway with which we can use CO2, but you just have to be careful, because recognizing that if it's a fuel, the lifetime of the carbon stored in that fuel is short. And so that's going to at best be a neutral process where the carbon goes back in the atmosphere if the CO2 is sourced from the atmosphere to begin with. But one thing I also just want to piggyback on something that Dan had said too, is that true that we need to develop the infrastructure to move the carbon around. But one thing that's true is that we can also think about hubs in the early days in regions like Wyoming, in regions like the Gulf Coast and also the Permian Basin, and even in West Virginia, where there's proper geology that will store the CO2 in a dedicated way. And in those hubs, we also have a lot of CO2 that's created that needs to be stored, in addition to the carbon removal that we need to do from the atmosphere. And so there's actually a lot of infrastructure in place already where we could think of this hubs concept. And these regions specifically also that have been hit by pollution associated with the fossil industry, and really consideration of environmental justice considerations in those regions where we look at co-benefits of establishing these approaches to reduce pollution in those specific regions.
Perfect, really helpful. Anything you wanted to add on to that, Dan?
Well, as Jen knows, I'm a big fan of storing carbon dioxide in concrete. I think we could actually imagine a negative emission concrete that's made with captured CO2, as long as we're also capturing the CO2 that's used in producing the cement and storing that safely. Generally, I think that the key in thinking about carbon utilization is you got to look at what the ultimate fate of that CO2 is. You can think about putting carbon dioxide into soft drinks, and A, that market is tiny, and B, that CO2 goes right back into the atmosphere. So that's not really going to get us anywhere. What we need to do is look at places where you can store gigaton scales of CO2, and in terms of utilization, that really comes down to concrete. And in the short term, I think there is a role for using CO2 in enhanced oil recovery, if that's managed so that there's a net reduction. That's controversial because of the potential to sort of perpetuate dependence on fossil fuels at a time when we have to, simultaneously be reducing our oil consumption through things like vehicle electrification. That's absolutely critical. But if we think about replacing the natural CO2 that is currently being mined and used for enhanced oil recovery with CO2 captured from the atmosphere, that's going to be a win for the environment. So I think those are really the two utilization opportunities that have kind of megaton to gigaton scale. And then beyond that, we just have to permanently store CO2 in underground reservoirs.
No, perfect. Appreciate that perspective. So let's turn to audience questions. We have a few that are being shared. One that I think is really much related to the discussion on additionality that was in the previous panel. The question from the questioner is how will Paris Accord global criteria on additionality help drive CCUS or not? So Dan, maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the Paris Accord sets an overall framework, but implementation really is up to individual countries. So I think the key really is thinking about the target that the president announced today. And again, to meet that, we've got to be reducing emissions from sources as rapidly as possible at the same time that we're scaling up carbon removal from the atmosphere. So, what matters to the atmosphere is the total amount of CO2 that's being emitted. moving it around from one country to another or from one source to another through offsets doesn't reduce emissions. I mean, it can play a role if it's done properly in managing costs, but you know, we have to get to net zero emissions, and that means that every ton that gets emitted in the long run has to be compensated by a ton that we're removing and storing permanently.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. Anything that you want to add to that, Jen?
No, I think that's
No. Okay. There's a question here on 45Q, and I guess that would be for Dan. Are there exceptions to the 100K minimum threshold, and would a year with less than the amount not receive any 45Q credits? And I don't know that I know enough about the nuances there, so maybe you do.
Yeah, so I think the original 45Q credit has a minimum threshold of
Right.
how much CO2 is captured each year to qualify. We would favor getting rid of that, because I think there's no reason to exclude some of the smaller sources that could qualify. I think there was maybe a worry about administrative burden if you had lots of tiny sources, but I think it makes sense to for some of the industrial sources where the amount of capture might be smaller, or early phase direct air capture, not to impose that kind of minimum. And I think that's under consideration.
Perfect. I think that makes a lot of sense. So Jen, what research and work is DOE doing on CCUS to verify carbon removal? I think that's something that has been on the minds, I think, of policymakers. You know, how do we make sure that we have good information?
It's a great question. So specifically to carbon dioxide removal, it's a little tricky because there's a lot of approaches. There's approaches where, you know, that are based upon nature and planting trees or improved forest management. There's improved carbon storage in soils. These ones that are nature-based, they're hard to really understand and measure exactly how much and to quantify how much carbon is stored in these projects. And so I think that is an outstanding challenge. If you have corporations that are wanting to that they want to purchase robust carbon dioxide removal offsets, then we do need to establish some kind of program that helps to do the carbon accounting in a careful and thoughtful way, but also that's consistent across all the approaches. Those are the nature-based ones, but what about when we think about direct air capture coupled to dedicated storage? From a quantifiable perspective, is a little bit easier in terms of carbon accounting. You know how much carbon that you're capturing from the atmosphere, you know what you're putting in the ground, and that the monitoring of that also is fairly straightforward, because we've been doing it, and we've had these projects associated with geologic storage already. In fact, we've been injecting CO2 since 1972 from enhanced oil recovery. So we know how to do this very well. We know how to quantify it. And oftentimes I'll just say too that the prices and the costs of doing direct air capture versus the nature-based, you know, we often say, oh, the nature-based options are just a lot less expensive than the engineered-based approaches. But when you actually think about robust carbon dioxide removal offsets and the fact that the forest might need to be managed over 100 to 1,000 years, if that's how long you need the CO2 to be stored, that actually might be pretty costly to think about how to manage that forest and how to maintain that robust carbon removal. And so being able to establish, you know, an approach that spans all of these different carbon dioxide removal technologies is a challenge, and it is something that we're thinking about, but it's an outstanding challenge at this time.
Is there anything that you need on expertise from the business community? What are the things that you're thinking of that DOE can't do in that space that, you know, outside sources might be able to do?
Well, I mean, I think making transparent the best possible projects and, you know, and imagine having ultimately a good, robust inventory of the projects that have been carefully quantified and measured. But at the same time, you need a third-party verifier that can go in there and do that and have the expertise across the different sectors. But I think transparency and data is quite useful and could be helpful for the community. to be able to do that. And I know that, Stripe, for instance, is making a lot of their first projects and the data transparent. And so I think that that's a really good approach.
Well, and a good question from the audience, kind of segueing from that. From an RD&D standpoint, what can be done to reduce the cost of CCUS from coal? There's a lot of talk about kind of getting to scale and how to reduce the costs. And first mover deployment is very expensive. How do we utilize the DOE complex and other research that might be able to be helpful?
I would rephrase that and ask, how do we just reduce the cost of carbon capture? And it goes back to what the panelists were saying. And it's not that it's too expensive, by the way. It's that we don't have the policies in place to make it economically viable. The technologies exist there. They exist at a cost. There are projects where we've done carbon capture for the industrial sector, like the bioethanol applications and hydrogen production, that have been operating for nearly a decade. And so it's not that we can't do it. And they exist for those technologies because, again, as I mentioned, those are more concentrated streams of CO2. So the carbon capture is pretty inexpensive for those processes compared to something that's very dilute, like direct air capture. So the only way that we can get the costs down in the absence of policy that helps us with that is learning by doing and actually deploying and building out the technologies that do exist today, and not just having one or two, but having dozens of these technologies so that we can truly move down the cost curve on them and hopefully close the economic gap so that we're not kind of forcing ourselves to just convert CO2 to a product, but that we can actually put it back in the ground, and that as a global society, we see benefit and value in putting that carbon back in the ground, which is really where most of it came from to begin with.
No, that's helpful. Dan, I think this could be for you. Jen, you might jump in as well. What's the state of carbon accounting tools and evaluating life cycle reductions? On the utilization side, I think it builds on a lot of the discussion on cost and verification that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think we do need some publicly available tools. It's being developed in the context of environmental product declarations. So for procurement, which you asked about earlier, as the government or private sector wants to procure low carbon concrete or cement or steel for building projects, you need a way to say, well, what qualifies as low carbon and what is it from a life cycle perspective? So that's kind of a first step. There are some privately developed tools. I think they need to be verified and kind of incorporated as public tools that everybody can have confidence in. I think that can be done, but that's certainly one of the key enablers to start really creating a market for low carbon products like concrete and steel.
Is that something that WRI is thinking about? Or are you guys weighing in there?
I don't know that we're going to get into actually doing the accounting on that at that level and the individual product level. We have published a paper on the idea of establishing low carbon standards for concrete and for cement and steel. And in that, we call for taking the first steps of developing these kinds of environmental product declarations and procurement as a way to create the market and then use that as the basis for setting stronger standards over time.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much to both of you, Dan and Jen. We have just a minute or two left. Just want to ask you for any final thoughts on this important subject and what you think of kind of the one next step that you'd like to see. So, Jen?
Sure. Well, so what we're excited about is absolutely thinking about deployment projects, but also being very thoughtful and strategic about where we site them, and recognizing that as we transition to a net zero carbon economy by 2050, that we don't want to leave communities behind, communities that have really helped to shape and build the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure that we have today. And so in some of these communities that are very deep seated in fossil fuels that may be transitioning away from not just through carbon capture, but actually just displacing those energy resources with zero emitting carbon resources like renewables, that we want to make sure that we are citing projects in regions that we make sure that there are good paying jobs, and that we are also have the co-benefits of reducing pollution in these communities that are often at the front lines. And so that's something that we are absolutely focusing on at the Department of Energy, in addition to just really, looking at the legacy of the fossil industry and trying to improve the infrastructure associated with minimizing the environmental impacts of fossil, and hopefully improving the legacy that we leave for future generations.
Thanks, Jen. And Dan?
Well, I'm very excited about the new target that the president announced today to cut our emissions in half by the end of this decade. That's very ambitious. It is achievable. We need to use every tool at our disposal to get there. We're going to need Congress to step up and pass a major infrastructure bill, as the president has outlined in the American Jobs Plan, and a clean electricity standard to really drive these markets and get us on track. So I think there's a lot of work to do, a lot of people ready to do it, and I'm excited about what the next few years are going to hold in developing these technologies and other low carbon technologies.
Well, thanks so much, Dan and Jen, for your important perspective here. And now I'll turn it back to Marty Durbin.
Well, let me again thank Senator Whitehouse and Senator Barrasso for being with us today, and for all of our truly excellent panelists. It's conversations like these that are crucial to moving these important technologies to deployment. And of course, I want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us as well. And I'll invite you to join us for our next session, which is scheduled for May 13th, where we'll be discussing permitting and transmission. You can find the registration link in the chat box here. So thank you all again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.